The temperature inside Declan Brennan's cabin held steady at 58 degrees, while the blizzard outside reached -37. He sat at his table eating dried venison, the floor beneath his feet radiating gentle warmth, no fire burning anywhere in the sealed structure. 20 yards away, Ronan Sullivan was freezing to death in a cabin filled with smoke from a fire he couldn't extinguish and couldn't live without. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The fire in the stone hearth had been dead for 6 hours. Declan Brennan fed the last piece of split pine into the coals 3 hours before dawn on February 18, 1856, and watched it burn down to nothing. The cabin temperature dropped steadily after that. By first light, frost formed on the inside of the leather window covering. By mid-morning, the water bucket near the door showed ice around its edges. Finn O'Malley sat on the sleeping platform wrapped in both their blankets and a buffalo robe. He had stopped shivering an hour earlier. That was a bad sign. Declan knew enough about freezing to understand that when the shivering stopped, the body was giving up. He sat beside Finn, sharing what warmth remained between them, knowing it wasn't enough. The storm had started 4 days earlier. Snow fell continuously, heavy and wind-driven, accumulating at a rate Declan had never seen in his 8 years trapping the Montana wilderness. By the second day, drifts reached the cabin's roofline. By the third day, they were burning furniture to stretch their firewood. By the fourth day, the wood was gone. They had cut and stacked what seemed like adequate supply in the fall, 18 cords of mixed pine and aspen, enough for a normal winter with surplus remaining. But this storm was not normal, and the cold that came with it demanded constant fire. They burned through their supply trying to maintain survivable temperature while wind found every gap in the chinked log walls. Finn spoke once that morning, his voice barely audible. Should have cut more wood. Declan said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had made a reasonable calculation based on past winters. The storm was an anomaly. Bad luck. The kind of random event that killed men in the mountains, regardless of preparation or skill. Finn died quietly just after noon. He simply stopped breathing, still wrapped in the blankets, his face peaceful. Declan sat with the body for an hour, watching frost form in Finn's beard, thinking about the sequence of small decisions that led to this moment. The decision to trap this particular drainage, the decision about how much wood would be sufficient, the decision to ride out the storm rather than attempt escape when it began. The temperature inside the cabin continued dropping. Declan knew he would follow Finn into death if the storm didn't break soon. He had perhaps 12 hours before cold took him the same way. His body was already conserving heat, shutting down peripheral circulation, preparing for the final shutdown. The storm broke that evening. Wind stopped. Snow ended. Temperature remained brutally cold, but the weather cleared enough that Declan could leave the cabin. He broke trail through chest-deep snow to a stand of dead pine 300 yards from the structure. He cut wood in the dark, hauled it back, rebuilt the fire. The cabin warmed slowly. He survived. He buried Finn 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen. The grave was shallow. He marked it with stones and stood there for a long time, thinking about heat and cold and the narrow margin between life and death in winter mountains. Declan stayed in the cabin through March, running his trap lines mechanically, processing pelts without enthusiasm. The work was familiar enough to require little thought, which left his mind free to circle endlessly around the same problem. Finn had frozen to death because the fire went out. The fire went out because the wood ran out. The wood ran out because the storm lasted longer than expected and demanded more fuel than calculated. Every trapper faced this equation. Some winters you guessed right about wood supply and survived. Some winters you guessed wrong and died. Most men accepted this reality as unchangeable as weather itself. Declan found he could not accept it. He started paying attention to how other trappers managed winter. In early April, he visited a camp 12 miles south where 2 French-Canadian brothers worked a beaver pond system. Their cabin showed typical construction. log walls chinked with moss and mud, single door, leather window covering, large stone fireplace that consumed enormous amounts of wood to produce modest heat. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney into the sky. The brothers told him about the winter. They had burned 22 cords of wood between November and March. 22 cords to keep 2 men alive in a space measuring 12 feet by 14 feet. The mathematics bothered Declan. That much wood represented weeks of cutting, splitting, and hauling. All that labor just to produce heat that mostly escaped unused. He visited 4 more camps that spring. Every cabin operated on the same principle. Burn wood continuously, except that most heat escapes. Cut more wood to compensate. Hope the supply lasts until spring. It was inefficient in a way that nagged at Declan's practical mind. In May, he traveled to a trading post on the Yellowstone River to sell his winter's fur collection. The pelts brought decent money, but Declan barely noticed the profit. He spent 3 days at the post studying how buildings held heat. The main trading structure used a central fireplace with stones stacked around it. The stones absorbed heat during the day and radiated it at night. The principle interested him. He talked to a Scottish stonemason working on a new warehouse. The man explained thermal mass, though he didn't use that term. Stone holds heat longer than wood or air, the mason said. Build with stone, you build warmth into the structure itself. Declan returned to his cabin in late May with a question forming. What if heat could be stored somehow? What if stone could hold enough warmth to keep a man alive without constant fire? The question seemed absurd even to him, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He began collecting stones that month, river rocks worn smooth by water, dense granite that felt heavy for its size. He started building fires and placing stones in the coals, then measuring how long they stayed hot after removal. It was crude experimentation, but it was a beginning. Other trappers noticed and thought his grief over Finn had damaged his mind. Declan spent June and July heating stones. He built fires outside his cabin every morning, placed different types of rocks in the coals, and recorded what happened. The process was tedious and occasionally dangerous, but patterns emerged quickly. Quartz exploded. He learned this the hard way when a fist-sized piece shattered in the fire, sending fragments across the clearing. One shard cut his forearm deep enough to scar. After that, he approached the fire ring more carefully and eliminated quartz entirely from consideration. Shale cracked without exploding. The layered structure couldn't handle rapid temperature change. The stone would heat evenly for an hour, then suddenly split along its natural planes, becoming useless fragments. Shale went into the rejection pile. Sandstone absorbed heat well but crumbled after repeated heating cycles. The first heating worked perfectly. The stone would stay warm for hours. But the second or third heating caused the surface to flake and deteriorate. Sandstone was too fragile for what Declan was envisioning. River granite worked perfectly. The dense, smooth stones heated slowly but held warmth for remarkable periods. A granite rock 8 inches in diameter, heated for 3 hours in hot coals, remained too hot to hold with bare hands for 6 hours after removal. Even 12 hours later, the stone radiated noticeable warmth. Limestone performed similarly. The light-colored stones were softer than granite, but equally effective at heat retention. Declan found he could heat limestone faster than granite, which might prove useful. He began timing everything: how long each stone type took to heat fully, how long each retained enough warmth to be useful, how much wood was required to heat stones versus heating a cabin directly through fireplace. The mathematics surprised him. Heating stones required intense fire for short duration. Heating a cabin required moderate fire for continuous duration. The stone method used roughly 1/10 the wood. By August, Declan had collected over 300 pounds of suitable river granite and limestone. He stacked them near his cabin in careful rows, separated by size and type. Other trappers passing through his area saw the rock piles and asked questions. "Building a wall?" one asked. "Something like that," Declan replied. "Seems like a strange use of time." Declan didn't argue. He was beginning to understand that what he was planning would seem insane to men who thought about cabins in traditional terms. A cabin was logs, mud, and a fireplace. That was the pattern. That was what worked. Anything else was suspicious. But Declan kept thinking about Finn wrapped in blankets, the fire dead, the cold creeping in. He thought about 22 cords of wood burned to keep 2 men alive. He thought about the fact that most heat from a fire went up a chimney into useless sky. There had to be a better method. Stone held heat. That much he had proven. The question now was how to use that property. How to build heat storage into a cabin structure. How to make warmth last. The answer came to him in September while digging a storage pit for root vegetables. The idea was simple. If heat rises and stone holds warmth, then heated stone below the floor would radiate upward for hours without any fire needed. The floor itself would become warm. A man could seal his cabin completely against a storm and still have heat. Declan started digging in late September 1856. He chose a location in the center of his cabin, equidistant from all walls, to distribute warmth evenly. The first challenge was removing his existing furniture and supplies to create working space. Everything went outside under canvas tarps. He used a short-handled spade designed for tight spaces. The cabin measured 14 feet by 16 feet. The tunnel he envisioned would run 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. That meant removing approximately 20 cubic feet of packed earth in a confined area with minimal headroom. The digging went slowly. He could work for maybe an hour before his back and shoulders demanded rest. The dirt had to be scooped into a wooden bucket, carried outside, and dumped far enough from the cabin that it wouldn't create drainage problems. Each bucket held roughly 1 cubic foot. He needed to move 20 buckets per day to stay on schedule. After a week, he had excavated a trench 18 inches deep. His hands developed new calluses. His shoulders ached constantly. But the outline of the tunnel was visible, 5 feet long, running east to west, 2 feet wide. The walls were rough, but would be smoothed later. In early October, a trapper named Cormac Doherty stopped by on his way to winter trapping grounds. He found Declan inside the cabin, shirtless and dirt-covered, digging a hole in his floor. "What in God's name are you doing?" Cormac asked. "Digging a tunnel," Declan said. "I can see that." "Why?" "Heat storage." Cormac stared at the excavation for a long moment. "You've gone mad. Finn's death broke. Something in your head." Declan kept digging. "Maybe. You're digging a grave in your cabin floor." "It's not a grave. What else would you call a hole this size?" Cormac shook his head. "This is what happens when a man spends too much time alone. You start thinking crazy thoughts. Make sense." After Cormac left, Declan continued working. By mid-October, the tunnel was complete. 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, 24 inches deep. The walls were vertical and smooth, the bottom was level. He had removed approximately 40 buckets of earth over 3 weeks of back-breaking work. He stood in his cabin that evening, looking at the rectangular hole in his floor. To anyone else, it looked insane. A perfectly excavated trench in the middle of a living space, serving no obvious purpose. But Declan saw something different. He saw the foundation of a heating system that would make winter survivable without constant fire. The hard part was finished. Now came the crucial work, building stone walls that would hold and radiate heat for hours. Declan spent the first week of November selecting stones for the tunnel walls. Not just any stones would work. Each needed to be roughly the same size for consistent stacking. Each needed flat surfaces for stable placement. Each needed to be granite or limestone, the types that held heat without cracking. He walked the creek beds within 2 miles of his cabin, examining thousands of stones, selecting fewer than 100. The chosen rocks were carried back and arranged by size near the cabin. Other trappers passing through saw him hauling stones and made jokes about rock collections and wasted effort. The wall construction began on November 8th. Declan started with the largest stones as a foundation layer along both sides of the tunnel. Each stone was placed carefully, tested for stability, adjusted until it sat perfectly level. The first layer took 3 days to complete. He mixed clay mortar using earth from a creek bank mixed with sand and water. The consistency had to be perfect, thick enough to hold shape, but wet enough to squeeze between stones. He tested 5 different ratios before finding one that worked. The second layer of stones went faster. Each rock was seated in mortar, positioned to overlap the joints below, creating an interlocking pattern. Declan worked slowly, checking alignment constantly. The walls needed to be vertical, not leaning inward or outward. Any tilt would create weakness. By the third layer, the tunnel walls stood 8 inches high. The space between them remained 2 feet wide. Declan could see the structure taking shape. 2 parallel walls of mortared stone, each 6 to 8 inches thick, running the full 5-foot length of the tunnel. The fourth layer brought the walls to 12 inches high. The mortar joints were tight, barely visible between stones. Declan wiped excess mortar as he worked, keeping the interior surface as smooth as possible. Rough surfaces would create air pockets that reduced heat transfer efficiency. The fifth and final layer completed the walls at 16 inches high. The total weight of stone in both walls exceeded 500 pounds. The structure was solid, immovable, built to last decades. Each wall contained approximately 30 stones, carefully selected and precisely placed. Declan let the mortar cure for a week. During that time, he built small fires in the tunnel to test draft and heating patterns. Smoke rose cleanly from the open top. Heat distributed evenly along the stone walls. The clay mortar hardened without cracking. In late November, Cormac Doherty returned through the area and stopped to check on Declan. He found the tunnel complete, stone walls built, looking like some kind of underground fireplace. "You built stone walls in a hole in your floor," Cormac said flatly. "Yes." "And this is supposed to heat your cabin?" "It will." Cormac shook his head but asked no more questions. Some things were beyond explanation. He left thinking Declan had created an elaborate grave marker for Finn, some kind of memorial that made sense only to a grieving mind. The stone walls were useless without a way to seal the tunnel and trap heat inside. Declan needed a cover that would fit precisely, conduct heat upward into the cabin floor area, and withstand repeated heating cycles without warping. Wood would burn, stone slabs would crack. Metal was the only option. Sheet metal was expensive on the frontier. A piece large enough to cover a 5-foot tunnel would cost more than Declan typically spent in 6 months. But without it, the entire system failed. He rode to the trading post on the Yellowstone in early December, his winter fur money in his pocket. The trading post had 2 options: tin-plated steel at $8 for a sheet measuring 6 feet by 3 feet, or copper at $22 for the same size. The steel was adequate. The copper was better, more durable, better heat conductor. Declan bought the copper. He also purchased a ball-peen hammer, metal shears, and a small anvil. The trader watched him load the supplies and asked what he was building. "A heating system?" Declan said. "For a cabin?" "Yes." The trader looked skeptical but took the money without further questions. The ride back took 2 days. The copper sheet was awkward to transport, catching wind like a sail. Declan arrived home to find tracks around his cabin. Someone had been inside. He found boot prints in the dirt around his tunnel, marks where someone had stood, examining the stone walls. He began working the copper the next day. The sheet needed to be cut to exact dimensions, 5 feet 3 inches by 2 feet 3 inches, with 3 extra inches on each side to rest on the cabin floor and prevent falling into the tunnel. He measured carefully and cut with the metal shears, the sound of cutting metal sharp in the winter silence. The edges needed to be folded over to create reinforced borders. He heated the edges, in his fireplace, until the copper glowed red, then hammered them flat across the anvil edge, creating a folded seam 1 inch wide around the entire perimeter. The reinforcement added rigidity and protected against sharp edges. He drilled 4 holes near the corners, threaded leather straps through them to create handles for lifting the heavy cover. The finished piece weighed approximately 35 pounds, awkward but manageable for 1 man. The first test came on December 20th. Declan built a fire inside the tunnel using dry pine. The flames heated the stone walls for 2 hours until they glowed faintly in the dim interior. He let the fire burn down to coals, then removed the remaining embers with a metal scoop. He positioned the copper cover over the tunnel opening. It fit perfectly. Within minutes, the copper surface grew warm to the touch. Within an hour, the metal was too hot to hold a hand against. Heat radiated upward into the cabin. The stone walls were transferring their stored warmth through the sealed tunnel space. Declan spent December testing the system obsessively. He built fires of different sizes, timed heating duration, measured how long warmth lasted after sealing. Each test refined his understanding of how the tunnel worked. A small fire using 10 pounds of wood and burned for 90 minutes heated the stones adequately, but not optimally. The walls radiated gentle warmth for 8 hours, enough to keep the cabin above freezing, but not comfortable. A larger fire using 20 pounds of wood and burned for 3 hours heated the stones to maximum capacity. The walls radiated strong heat for 14 hours, keeping the cabin at 55 degrees, even when outside temperature dropped to 0. This was the optimal ratio. He learned that stone temperature mattered more than fire size. A hot, fast fire worked better than a slow, smoldering fire. The goal was getting maximum heat into the stone mass quickly, then sealing immediately to trap it. He discovered that removing all ash and embers before sealing was critical. Any remaining combustion consumed oxygen in the sealed tunnel and produced smoke that reduced heat transfer efficiency. The tunnel needed to be clean, just hot stones and trapped air. By late December, Declan could operate the system efficiently. Evening routine became predictable. Build fire in tunnel at sunset. Burn hard for 2.5 to 3 hours. Remove embers. Seal with copper cover. Sleep through the night in a warm cabin with no active fire anywhere. The wood savings were dramatic. Traditional fireplace heating required constant feeding, consuming approximately 40 pounds of wood per day in deep winter. The tunnel system used 20 pounds every 14 hours, roughly 35 pounds per day. Declan was burning 15% less wood while maintaining better temperature stability. On January 4, 1857, Cormac Doherty stopped by again. He had been trapping a drainage 15 miles north and was passing through on his way to check traps farther south. He arrived at midday. Declan's cabin was warm. No smoke came from the chimney. No fire burned in the fireplace. The copper cover over the tunnel radiated heat into the space. Cormac stood in the cabin, confused. "Where's your fire?" he asked. "Don't need one right now. The cabin's warm." "Yes." Cormac looked around, saw the copper cover, understood suddenly. "The tunnel is heating this place. Has been since last night." Cormac knelt and held his hand near the copper surface. The heat was obvious, radiating upward steadily. He looked at Declan with something between amazement and suspicion. "This actually works." "It works. How long does the heat last?" 12 to 14 hours, depending on how hot I get the stones." Cormac sat at the table, thinking, "You're burning less wood, about a third less, and no fire needed overnight." "None." Cormac asked detailed questions about construction, operation, cost. Declan answered everything. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. If the system could help other men survive winter, that was good. The memory of Finn freezing made him generous with knowledge. Cormac left that afternoon thoughtful and quiet. The weather changed in early January. Declan noticed it first in the morning sky, a particular color of gray that old trappers called stormlight. The air felt heavy and still. Birds disappeared from the forest. These signs meant something large was building. By January 7th, other trappers were noticing too. A man named Ronan Sullivan stopped by Declan's cabin that afternoon. He had been trapping the high country and was moving to lower elevation before weather trapped him. "Big storm coming," Ronan said. "Maybe the biggest I've seen." "When?" 2 days. Maybe 3. Ronan looked at Declan's modest woodpile, perhaps 4 cords stacked against the cabin wall. "That's not enough wood if this storm is what I think it is." "It's enough," Declan said. Ronan shook his head. "I've got 12 cords stacked, and I'm worried it's not sufficient. You're going to freeze with that amount." Declan didn't explain the tunnel. Ronan wouldn't understand, and there wasn't time to demonstrate the system properly. "I'll be fine." Ronan left unconvinced, heading toward his own cabin 3 miles east. Declan spent January 8th preparing. He checked the tunnel carefully, looking for any cracks in the mortar, any loosened stones, any weakness that might fail under extended use. Everything was solid. He tested the copper cover fit. Perfect seal. He organized his firewood for easy access even in deep snow. He filled every container with water. Once the storm hit, melting snow for water would waste fuel. He cooked a large pot of venison stew, enough for several days. Cold food was better than wasting wood on cooking fires during a crisis. Inside the cabin, he sealed every gap in the walls with additional clay chinking. He reinforced the leather, window covering. He checked the door fit and added weather stripping made from strips of hide. The goal was making the structure as airtight as possible. On January 9th, the storm arrived. Snow began falling at dawn, light at first, then increasingly heavy. By noon, visibility dropped to 20 yards. By evening, wind increased and temperature plummeted. Declan could hear the storm building, that particular howl wind makes when it's going to last for days. He charged the tunnel system at sunset, building the hottest fire he had ever made inside it. He burned the fire for 4 full hours, far longer than normal, heating the stone walls until they glowed visibly even in daylight. He wanted maximum heat storage before the worst weather arrived. After removing the embers and sealing the tunnel, the cabin temperature climbed to 62 degrees. The copper cover was almost too hot to approach. Heat radiated so intensely that Declan had to move his sleeping platform farther away. Outside, snow fell steadily. Wind drove it horizontal. Temperature dropped to -15 and continued falling. The blizzard of 1857 had begun, and it would kill 7 men before it ended. The snow fell for 3 days without stopping. Declan watched through gaps in his window covering as drifts climbed toward the roof line. By the second day, snow completely blocked his door. By the third day, the cabin was buried except for the chimney top, which he kept clear by pushing a pole upward through the opening every few hours. Inside, the tunnel system worked perfectly. Every 12 hours, Declan opened the copper cover, built a fire in the tunnel, heated the stones, and sealed it again. The cabin temperature never dropped below 55 degrees. He used approximately 30 pounds of wood per day, a fraction of what traditional heating would require. On the second night, he heard something outside. Faint sounds that might have been shouting, distorted by wind and snow. He opened the door enough to look out, but saw nothing except white darkness. The sounds didn't repeat. He sealed the door and returned to the warmth. The storm broke on January 13th. Wind stopped. Snow ended. Temperature remained brutal, -37 degrees, but the sky cleared to hard blue. Declan dug his way out through the door drift, a tunnel through 8 feet of packed snow. The landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts covered everything, trees bent under snow weight. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just cold. He found Ronan Sullivan 23 yards from his cabin door. The body was frozen solid, partially buried in snow. Ronan had tried to reach Declan's cabin and collapsed within sight of it. His hands were bare, his coat open. The final stages of freezing made men strip off clothes, a cruel trick the body played when core temperature dropped too far. Declan followed Ronan's back trail to his cabin 3 miles east. The door hung open. Inside, the cabin was full of smoke residue, every surface coated with black soot. The fireplace showed evidence of a massive fire that had burned too hot and too long. The chimney had apparently become blocked with snow, forcing smoke back into the cabin. Ronan had faced an impossible choice: keep the fire burning and suffocate from smoke, or let it die and freeze. He had chosen to run, probably hoping to reach help. He had made it almost to Declan's door. Over the next week, Declan learned about other deaths. 2 trappers 15 miles north had frozen when their wood supply ran out on the second day. A trapper to the south had died from smoke inhalation, found dead in his cabin beside a smoldering fire. 3 more men had abandoned their cabins during the storm and died in the snow trying to reach trading posts or other settlements. Cormac Doherty survived. He appeared at Declan's cabin on January 20th, thin and shaken but alive. He had built a crude version of the tunnel system in his own cabin after visiting in early January, just a simple pit with heated stones and a wooden cover. It had worked well enough to keep him alive. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains in 1857. By March, the remaining trappers emerged from winter camps and gathered at the trading post on the Yellowstone. 7 men had died in the blizzard of January 13th. The survivors traded stories of how they had endured. Cormac Doherty told everyone about Declan's tunnel system. He described the stone walls, the copper cover, the heat that lasted 14 hours without fire. Other trappers listened with the careful attention men give to information that might save their lives. 3 trappers visited Declan's cabin that spring to see the system themselves. He showed them everything, explained the construction process, shared the measurements and techniques. None of them mocked the tunnel anymore. They took notes, asked detailed questions, measured the dimensions carefully. By summer, 2 of those trappers had begun building similar systems in their own cabins. The construction varied based on available materials and individual skill. One man used flat stones instead of river rocks. Another built his tunnel only 3 feet long instead of 5. But the core principle remained the same: stone walls heated by fire, sealed to trap warmth, radiating heat for hours without combustion. The name that caught on was simply heat tunnel, or sometimes Irish tunnel, in reference to Declan's heritage. Instructions spread through word of mouth. A trapper would see a system, learn how it worked, build his own version, then share the knowledge with others. By 1860, heat tunnels were common enough in remote mountain cabins that travelers expected to find them. Declan continued trapping until 1863, when the fur trade collapsed entirely. Beaver populations had been decimated, and silk had replaced felt in hat production. The economic foundation of mountain life disappeared. Most trappers moved on to other territories or other professions. Declan settled in the Bitterroot Valley, bought land with his saved fur money, and raised cattle on a small ranch. He married a widow named Catherine in 1865. They had no children but lived quietly and comfortably. He rarely spoke about his trapping years and never mentioned the tunnel system he had invented. He died in August of 1872 at age 54 from pneumonia. Catherine buried him in a small cemetery outside Stevensville. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, nothing more. No mention of the innovation that had saved lives across 2 decades. But in the mountains, the tunnels remained. Prospectors discovered abandoned cabins with mysterious stone-lined pits and figured out their purpose. Settlers moving into remote areas found the systems and maintained them. Hunters and trappers continued building new versions well into the 1880s. Modern historians estimate that heat tunnels saved dozens of lives during severe winters between 1857 and 1880. The exact number cannot be known because survival leaves fewer records than death. But the evidence exists in the structures themselves. Stone walls built into cabin floors across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, silent testimony to what one man's grief and obsessive intelligence accomplished on the American frontier.